This is Talk Business and Politics with Roby Brock.
Welcome to the program. I'm Roby Brock. We're glad to have you and hope that you're enjoying your Labor Day weekend. There is a lot popping on the economic front. Let's get right to it with our first guest. Economist Mervin Jebaraj is the director of the Center for Business and Economic Research at the University of Arkansas Walton College of Business. Mervin, welcome and congrats on your recent 40 Under 40 award from our sister publication, the Northwest Arkansas Business Journal. We're proud to have you as one of our award winners this year.
Well, thank you very much, Roby.
Well, turning to the economic front, President Trump has ordered American companies out of China. How might that happen? It seems that the two economies could not be divested of one another very easily. Arkansas has some pending investments from China. You got Walmart, Tyson Foods have operations in China. You've got the farmers who've been hit by the Chinese tariff war. How easy would it be to exit China?
Well, it's a lot harder than just issuing an order, for one. But I think, in general, you look at how much trade happens between the United States and China. That's anywhere around $500 billion worth of products come in from China to the United States. It's not very easy. It's not like you can flip and switch and find new suppliers for $500 billion worth of goods coming into the United States. So currently what we have are tariffs on $250 billion worth of imports from China. Those were tariffed last year at 10%. They moved up to 25% this year. Now they're threatening to go to 30% on that $250 billion, the original tariffs that were imposed on China last year. Those are tariffs on intermediate goods. And what we mean by that is it's not goods that you and I necessarily go out and buy directly at the store. These are things that manufacturers in the United States import from China and use to make other goods that are then sold on to consumers here in the United States or exported elsewhere in the world. So those are $250 billion worth of goods. Import tariffs were imposed last year, 10%. This year in the spring, it moved up to 25%. And now in the latest round of escalations, it looks like it'll go up to 30% starting in September 1st. So you're looking at manufacturers in the United States that are paying anywhere, last year 10% more, 25% more this spring, and soon 30% more for those intermediate goods that they then use to produce other goods, cars or electronics or furniture or whatever it is here in the United States. And it's not like you can easily find substitute suppliers for those products that we're importing from China and then manufacturing other goods with. It's not like you could go to the local hardware store and buy a replacement part that you can then put in your machines or in your cars or whatever else you're making here in the United States. Oftentimes, manufacturers in the United States set up long-term supply chains, long-term agreements with manufacturers in other countries to give them a very specific part to very specific dimensions, specifications, quality constraints, etc. And those very specific parts go into whatever is being manufactured in the United States. And it's very hard to actually find a new supplier that can produce the exact same thing at the exact specification, at the exact quality level, and ramp up production so as not to affect production here in the United States. So very often, it's very hard to do that in the short run. So we've only had a year when tariffs have gone up from what they were previously before any tariffs were imposed, about 3% to 10% to 25% to 30% starting on September 1st. So it is near impossible for manufacturers to find a substitute within that time period and not even know whether they're going to need to find a substitute for those things or not, because we keep talking about whether or not these tariffs will be permanent, whether the trade negotiations are going to work and will back off these tariffs. So manufacturers don't know whether they should find new suppliers or not, even if that's going to take several years. They haven't started the process because they don't have certainty on where we're going with China and trade.
Well, there's nothing like a little uncertainty in business. Let's talk about another China angle. China is seeing some slower economic growth than in previous years. Actually, many countries are. Is this global economic slowdown that we've been warned about, is that actually happening? What are some of the signs that a recession could be in the works, or will we avoid one, as the Trump administration suggests?
Well, I think what you're looking at, here in the domestic economy, a lot of people are talking about a recession happening next year. If you poll various economists, about 60% of them think that there will be a recession either in 2020 or 2021. And the proximate cause for all these recessions and talk of recessions here in the United States and in other countries tends to emanate from the trade war that was started in the beginning of 2018. So before that, we didn't really have any talk of recession. We were talking about how long we can keep this economic expansion going. But since the trade wars have started, both the U.S. economy looks like it's slowing down and might be heading to a recession next year or the year after. But around us, when you look at the global economy, you see several countries where their economies have slowed down drastically. Take our neighbors to the north, Canada. They had a 0.1 to 0.4% growth in the last few quarters. It's very slow economic growth. That puts them very close to zero, which puts them in contraction territory. It could take them into a recession in the upcoming quarters. Mexico had 1 quarter of negative economic growth and followed up that quarter of negative economic growth with a positive 0.1% economic growth, so barely missed an official recession there in Mexico, but very likely is already in a recession. And you take some of our largest trading partners in the European Union. Germany's had a negative quarter of economic growth, very likely is headed to a recession there. Great Britain's had a negative quarter of economic growth, and with a hard Brexit looking more and more likely, it looks like both Germany and Great Britain will head for a recession. Italy is already in a recession. Around the world, if you look at Singapore, South Korea, Russia, these countries may or may not already be in recession. They've certainly already had negative quarters of economic growth. And further to the south, Brazil has had a negative quarter of economic growth and very likely is already in a recession. Argentina has already been in a recession, but they might be headed for more of a crisis as well with the latest election results there. So if you look at our major trading partners, people that matter in the global economy, a lot of these different countries are headed for a recession. What is different now than previous recessions, I think you have far less global coordination as a response to these recessions. There are fewer and fewer leaders in several of these countries that believe in globalism, that believe in working together to address this recession. So you're going to see a lot of isolationists trying to look after their own country, but that doesn't really work when all of our trading partners in several countries around the world are headed for a recession. That is going to need some coordinated responses. And just reading between the leaves from the G7 meetings that recently finished up, we're not seeing a whole lot of global coordination there. So it looks like we could try to avoid this recession by scaling back on those trade wars, but that doesn't seem to be on the cards right now.
And on the domestic front, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell's been in the hot seat for his handling of the economy, at least by the president. The Feds have sent signals that they are prepared to cut interest rates. What do you think would trigger that? What else is at their disposal?
So the Federal Reserve's policy toolkit is, somewhat limited given that their interest rates are already fairly low. We're about 2.25% right now from any historical perspective outside of this economic expansion that has been some of the lowest policy rates the Federal Reserve has ever set during an economic expansion. So they don't have a lot of room to cut from 2.25 before they're already at zero. So the question you really have to ask when you're talking about Federal Reserve policy is their mandate as the Federal Reserve is to maintain maximum employment and stable levels of inflation. We have very low levels of inflation right now. We have not hit the Federal Reserve's target of 2% inflation, so that's not a concern. Our unemployment rate, at least the headline unemployment rate, is really low. We may not actually be close to full employment yet just because we think the labor force participation rate is not as high as it could be. We haven't seen strong enough wage growth that usually comes with maximum employment. So the Federal Reserve hasn't met that part of its mandate yet. And so the Federal Reserve is taking out insurance now in the form of rate cuts. They're trying to go early because they don't really have a lot of room to cut. Given that the rates are already so low, going from 2 to 0 is not going to do a whole lot. Capital, if businesses are willing to invest money in the economy, capital is already very, very cheap. Companies can borrow at very low costs to invest in the economy, but they don't want to borrow because of the uncertainty from the trade war and the global economic slowdown that came from it. So it's not entirely clear that the Federal Reserve cutting rates is going to do a whole lot to stimulate the economy without some policy coordination on the fiscal side, especially backing off of some of the trade wars. And that's what we don't see likely to happen. And we don't also likely to see a lot of policy coordination between countries in this particular instance because of the skirmishes that we've had over the trade war. So the Federal Reserve is probably going to cut rates because they're going to do everything they have within their arsenal to try to expand or keep this economic expansion going. But there's only so much that can do, because right now what isn't a problem isn't cheap capital, it's business uncertainty, and that's not something that the Federal Reserve can fix.
He is Mervin Jebaraj, economist at the University of Arkansas Walton College of Business. There is a reason why we have him here on a steady basis. Thanks for your great insight, Mervin.
Well, thank you.